views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening. Welcome to BronxTalk. Happy New Year to one and all. It's time for us to get back to work. Our guest tonight is the youngest member of the City Council. Though he's a freshman, he's a deputy leader of the council and also the chair of the council's Public Housing Committee. So we've got a ton of housing questions on tap for tonight. We'll also talk about the current police and safety controversies in the city and much more. For the first time in a little while, the phones are open. So if you'd like to join the conversation with questions or comments, please call in at 718-960-7261, which is a new number for us. That's 7261. That's the new number. Also, you can post comments on our Facebook page or send them in an email to BronxTalk@bronxnet.org, and we pass them along and try to get you an answer for anything that is your concern. For the here and now, we welcome the Deputy Leader of the City Council from the 15th Council District, Councilmember Richie Torres. Nice to have you, sir.
It's a pleasure to be here. And Happy New Year, and congratulations on your 20th anniversary.
20 years, I know,
yes.
It's hard to believe.
I was 6, watching at 6 years old.
The youngest member
Yes,
of the City
yes,
Council.
yes.
There it is.
But fast aging.
I'm sure you've been watching all those 20 years. Anyway, let's get right to it. So much on our table tonight. There are a number of controversies, plural, surrounding the NYPD and the best way to keep New Yorkers safe. Sort it out for us. Did the mayor make errors? Were the officers out of turn for even a second time turning their backs on him during the funerals? And where are we at in improving police tactics to the satisfaction of your constituents and others in the Bronx?
So I think it's fair to say that the city's living in an especially tense moment, and that the tensions have never felt more combustible. First you had the tragic, cold-blooded murder of these 2 police officers, which has all of us in a state of mourning and shock and trauma. And then you have this tragedy unfolding against the backdrop of a divisive and heated debate around policing in New York City. And so, we're living in a combustible moment for race relations, for policing, and it seems to me the mayor's trying to manage the situation with as much anonymity as he can, but he's struggling.
Are they connected? Do you see them as connected in terms of, the way I look at it, there's one issue, and that issue is police tactics and what's the best way, as I mentioned a moment ago, to keep New Yorkers safe. And on the other hand is, of course, this horrible, inexcusable violence against police officers. Are they connected, or can we keep them separate? Can the mayor keep them separate? Give me something on what you think ought to really happen here, to kind of look at both ends of the equation.
Look, if you take the murder of those 2 police officers, it seems to me it was a psychopath who went on a rampage killing. But, based on his tweets, based on his social media comments, he was clearly driven by a hatred for police officers. And there has been too much invective hurled at police officers, but we have to be careful not to characterize all criticism of policing policy as an attack on individual officers. So we have to draw a distinction between constructive criticism of policy and destructive criticism specifically aimed at individual officers.
We had the chair of the Public Safety Committee, your colleague Vanessa Gibson, in here. And she was talking about a number of reforms, which we don't have to break down every single one of them here and now for tonight. What is most interesting to you and most important to you in reforming the police department, again, so that people in the Bronx feel comfortable about who's policing them and the tenor in their neighborhoods?
The conversation about police reform is part of a broader conversation about reform of the criminal justice system. And there are a few goals here, some of which are intentions. So, we have an interest in improving police-community relations. We have an interest in improving the day-to-day interactions between police and civilians. We have an interest in ensuring that morale in the police department remains high. and in mitigating the consequences of contact with the criminal justice system. You know, if you're arrested for a minor crime, you're going to have a criminal record that will haunt you for the rest of your life, and that will limit your access to employment and housing and education, and that will limit your economic opportunities. And so we have to figure out, how do we promote social order while limiting the collateral consequences of some of these arrests? You know, how can we reform the manner in which we police minor crimes? We all agree that we should aggressively police major crimes, but the policing of minor crimes, in my opinion, has been overzealous.
And ironically now, there's allegedly, I mean, it's never really been confirmed, a police slowdown, and there are fewer tickets being written,
right,
and arrests and other things for so-called minor crimes. And yet, of course, today they boasted about how the crime numbers went down. I guess that would back up what your contention is.
Well, there's been a work stoppage for 2 weeks, so I want to be careful not to draw a definitive conclusion based on 2 weeks.
Fair enough.
But take the debate about stop and frisk, right? We were all led to believe that if we were to reduce the number of stops in New York City, that it would unleash a wave of violent crime. That's what Commissioner Kelly said. That's what Mayor Bloomberg said. In 2011, the number of stops in the city was 700,000. In 2014, it was 50,000. And as the number of stops have gone down, so has the crime rate. So the notion that stop and frisk prevents crime was thoroughly refuted by the crime stats. And I do believe that we could reform the manner in which we police minor crimes without endangering public safety.
Are you happy with what you've heard out of Bill Bratton as far as willingness to reform tactics in the system?
I wish he would do more, but I certainly support the reform of marijuana enforcement, you know, opting for summonses in the place of arrest. And we should go in the direction of identifying a list of minor offenses for which summonses could be a more appropriate response than arrest. So limit, again, exposure to the criminal justice system.
You acknowledged just a moment ago that the mayor was somewhat caught in the middle, and what did you like that you heard, and maybe what do you think he needs to work on now to really heal the city? Many people, aside from what you think of what Pat Lynch said, that the officer's blood is on his hands, which is just something else, but really at his feet now is the responsibility to help heal the city. So what does he need to do a better job at to heal the city?
Well, you know, what I find striking is that the tensions between the mayor and the police unions have very little to do with policy. As far as I know, there is no policy difference between Pat Lynch and Bill de Blasio. It has everything to do with politics. It's about the politics of race, the politics of labor negotiations. And so that's what I find most striking, is that most of the inflammatory rhetoric and most of the combustible tension has been driven by politics.
I have to tell you, that's a very interesting analogy.
But what's the policy difference? I know of no policy difference.
That they both would, well, I mean, certainly Pat Lynch would not have been happy about backing off stop and frisk.
That's not true. The UF 250s, the union was very concerned about reducing policing to a numbers game, concerned about these productivity goals, these quotas. So some of the most thoughtful criticisms of stop and frisk came from the PBA. So there's much more commonality than the media is willing to lead you to believe.
So maybe we get a conclusion to my question, and that is maybe the mayor needs to continue to find places where they can have dialogue and agree on and work with those positive things and go from there. We just came up with a suggestion from that.
I'm not sure. I'm not so optimistic. I mean, part of me feels like part of it is a discussion about race, right? And it's impossible to have a conversation about race without provoking strong emotion from all sides. So part of me, I'm a fatalist. I believe that the debate is almost inevitably divisive.
Let's roll up our sleeves and talk about really your specialty and what you...
Politics?
No. I want to talk about housing. You know, I'd rather not talk about politics, I can tell you that. According to the latest report, the Bronx is the country's most unaffordable rent market. Poverty and low income levels and high rents are making for a very expensive mix for your constituents and many people through the borough. There are two sides to the equation, and we'll talk about affordable housing. How do we raise Bronxites out of relative poverty so they can afford more and better places to live?
Well, there are two dimensions to affordability, right? So one is the rent, is you can regulate rents either through the creation of affordable housing, through public housing,
which
through
we're
Section
definitely
8,
going to talk about
through rent
before you leave
regulation.
tonight.
But then part of it is incomes, right? The mistake that we make is when we are speaking about affordable housing, we focus narrowly on rent. So the median rent in Brooklyn and Manhattan is either at or approaching $3,000 a month. But it's not enough to look at rent. You have to look at rent as a share of income. And when you consider those two variables, rent as a share of income, the Bronx is the least affordable borough, because even though we have the lowest rents, we have disproportionately lower incomes and therefore have the worst rent burdens. There are communities in the Bronx where the average resident is paying more than 50% of their income toward rent. So those families are at high risk of homelessness.
So how do we raise them out of poverty or relative poverty so that they can afford more, and if the rents are a little higher, and we know that the rents are too damn high, that Bronxites can do a little better?
Well, the long-term solution is job creation and economic opportunity. But in the short term, we should aggressively create affordable housing. The mayor does have a historic plan. It's a $41 billion plan that will unfold over the next 10 years. He's going to preserve 120,000 units of affordable housing and create 80,000 new units. But even the mayor's housing plan, however historic, as historic as it may be, has severe limitations. So the mayor is going to create 80,000 new units over the course of the next 10 years. In New York City, we have about 1 million households who can only afford rents at 50% of AMI, yet we only have 450,000 units suitable for those households. So that's a 550,000 unit gap. And even if we were to create 80,000 units tomorrow, we would still fall well short of bridging the gap between the demand for affordable housing and the supply of affordable housing.
Does the process, or should the process also include something you said, maybe a larger commitment to renovating substandard housing right now?
I mean, we should, preservation has to be...
In other words, you say, well, right. Where is the housing?
But
maybe that's where it is.
Not just a question of just sheer numbers, is that the demand for affordable housing far exceeds the supply. And we see that dynamic play out in a few ways. First you have a homeless shelter. We have historic rates of homelessness. Homeless municipal shelter system overflowing with about 60,000 families a night. 60,000. Many of whom are children, right? There are children who have grown up in New York City who have never known life outside a shelter. The waiting list for public housing has over 200,000 families. There's effectively a moratorium on Section 8, which has a waiting list of over 100,000 families. So we're facing a catastrophic crisis of affordability in New York City. There's no question about it.
The Daily News editorialized that the responsibility for fixing public housing falls squarely, I'm sure you saw it because they singled you out, falls squarely on the lap of the City Council, and they singled you out as the chair of the Public Housing Committee. What are the Council's responsibilities, and what can you and the Council get done to fix the mammoth beast that public housing has become in the city? And what's fascinating to me is the number that you quoted, 200,000 people on a waiting list to get into places that are falling apart. That shows a level of desperation that is rather remarkable. But really, where is the Council at, and what can you and your colleagues do?
Well, it's worth pointing out that most of the funding for public housing is federal, right? Each level of government has a role in maintaining public housing. Public housing is largely funded and regulated by the federal government. It's an authority. NYCHA is an authority, therefore it's created by the state government. And the mayor appoints the chairperson of the New York City Housing Authority, so the chairperson is as accountable to the mayor as any commissioner in city government. So every level of government has a role in preserving public housing, or should have a role.
And what should the City Council do?
Well, it comes down to more resources, but it's not only the City Council. So we have to, first it's worth understanding...
So it sounds like the City Council has to do some dialogue with colleagues in other branches.
Well, first I think it's worth understanding that, NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, we have the largest public housing stock, not only in the country, but in the continent of North America, right? Public housing houses a population the size of Boston. About 500,000 residents live in public housing. If public housing were a city, it would be bigger than most big cities. If you were to take the top 10 largest public housing authorities, NYCHA is larger than the rest of the 9 combined. Right. So it is uniquely critical to the affordability of our city. And what we've seen over the last 15 years is disinvestment at every level of government. Since 2001, the federal government has been severely underfunding the housing authority. In 1998, the state withdrew all operating funds from the housing authority, and the city did the same in 2003. And not only has the city withdrawn operating support, but the city has been extracting arbitrary payments, billions of dollars worth of payments from the housing authority. And so the effect of all those budget cuts, all that disinvestment at every level of government has saddled NYCHA with a backlog of $18 billion worth of unmet capital needs, which means that NYCHA does not have the resources to bring every boiler, all the bricks, all the elevators, all the roofs into a state of good repair.
So what is the answer for, now I'm going to give you a real example. When we announced on Facebook that you were coming on the show and we're going to talk about housing, I got a back and forth with somebody who said that they had contacted your office and had done very well, and your office was incredibly supportive, helped her get heat in her public housing apartment. But she said, unfortunately, it only lasted for a couple of days. And I said, and so how is your apartment tonight as the weather gets colder? She says, it's cold. This is, to me, inhuman, unfair, and I know you certainly agree.
But the trouble is that we direct our outreach toward NYCHA. Ultimately, NYCHA is an agent of the government, the federal, state, and city government. And our outreach should be directed toward the elected officials who continue to defund or underfund the housing authority. If you had a private landlord who withdrew all operating funds from the maintenance of his own building, what would happen to that landlord? You would have every elected official condemn him publicly. That landlord could potentially face civil as well as criminal prosecution for endangering the welfare of his tenants. But when the government systematically disinvests from public housing, there are no political consequences, no moral consequences, no legal consequences.
Of course, someone could certainly say, and that's what the Daily News was suggesting, is that you and the city council are the landlords for that.
I agree, and I'm fighting the good fight, and we were able to secure some new resources, but I'm only one person. And I mean, look, I'm
passionate about this issue.
And I have a few
doubt.
suggestions. So, the state has about $5 billion worth of bank settlements. A share of those settlements should go toward rehabilitating the public housing stock. $1 billion. The mayor has a $41 billion plan that includes $8 billion in subsidies. A share of those subsidies should go toward preservation in public housing. So I'm a strong advocate for more resources in public housing.
Sounds like a priority thing, that if you can raise it up people's priority scales and maybe awareness, like sitting on the TV show tonight and talking
and that's what I've done. I think, I've tried to leverage the power that I have through my, I chair the Committee on Public Housing, so I've tried to leverage the oversight power that I have to elevate the issue.
Now, this three strikes landlord bill that you have authored, and I guess it's law now, right? It's been pushed through. The one
it's going to take effect in mid-2000.
And I'm going to summarize it and tell me if I got it wrong. The summary is that if a landlord 3 different times has violations, then what happens to that landlord?
It's more complicated than that.
I knew it was.
But
I was trying to move us ahead. Go ahead.
But to understand the workings of the three strikes law, you have to understand the tenant experience. So if you have a dangerous or immediately dangerous condition in your apartment, you can call 311, and 311, HPD will send an inspector to your apartment and will issue what is known as a notice of violation. The problem with a notice of violation is that it has the same effect as a parking ticket without a fine.
Right.
There's no fine, there's no fee attached to it, and therefore the landlord has no incentive to correct the condition. And so under the three strikes law, if a landlord fails to repair a dangerous condition within the legal time frame, you get 1 strike. You have 3 strikes, then HPD can impose inspection fees.
Here's the question I have. Historically, HPD, and we've had a big problem with numbers of inspectors and inspections. So it's nice to say if they're inspected 3 times, many people would say, well, you know what? We can't get inspections 3 times because there's just not enough to go around. Are you confident that there are enough inspectors?
I am, actually. Actually, that's we have the finest system of code enforcement. Vito Mastriciullo, who heads code enforcement in New York City, is the finest deputy commissioner of city government.
There you go.
We have well over 100, and we have enough resources to. But that could be in danger because most of housing code enforcement in New York City is funded by community development block grant funding, federal funding, which is always in danger. So.
Let's go to the telephone. Our buddy Bob from the Bronx News, and I'm sure you know Bob. Press?
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him. Man, that's a lot. Anyway, hi Bob. Happy New Year to you.
Good evening, Gary. Let's start the New Year off right.
Okay.
So Bob no longer likes me.
I followed the councilman's race last year.
You got him?
And
Okay.
one problem that wasn't
I didn't. Okay.
the chief of staff for the former councilman had was he couldn't say what exactly the council did in the district for 12 years. Now, you've been in for a year already now, Councilman Torres. What have you done the past year to improve your district?
Okay.
I can't.
Okay, I'll repeat the question. Thank you, Bob. The question was, what have you done in the year to improve your district?
What have I done? Okay. Well, okay.
Okay, we can get rid of that. Go ahead.
Right. Well, obviously, I have a particular passion for public housing, so I have about 5 public housing.
Having lived in public housing.
Having lived in public housing, and I care deeply about NYCHA, because NYCHA not only manages public housing but administers Section 8, and my district has the highest concentration of Section 8 vouchers. But I made the largest investment in the security of public housing in my district. It was $3 million, which was by far the largest investment in the city, and might have been the largest investment of any legislator in the history of NYCHA. So that's one thing that we've done. We were able to pioneer the use of health bucks so that more of our constituents can access healthy foods at affordable rates. And I'm introducing legislation that is improving the quality of our housing stock, and not only the 3 strikes law, but the underlying conditions law. We're looking to allow tenants the ability to go to housing court to secure an underlying condition. So if you have a condition like mold or leaks, and the landlord is simply cosmetically painting over the problem rather than resolving the underlying condition, you can go to court, get an order, and force the landlord to get to the root of the problem.
One of the big dialogues right now and important issues in the Bronx is...
And one more thing, just participatory budgeting as well. So we are...
Which I would love to ask you about, but we're not going to have enough time for it.
So there are, 9 council members in the Bronx delegation, if you include the speaker, and only 3 of us are engaging in participatory budgeting, but I'm allowing my constituents an opportunity to play a role in how $1 million is spent in their district.
What I was going to get to is the notion of gentrification. Now, the Daily News in that editorial also talked about using vacant lands and turning some of that over to market rate housing.
Yeah.
Are you concerned about gentrification because there are 2 developments that are going to be almost essentially all affordable, but do you like the idea of bringing in other people, bringing in people from the outside who may pay market rate housing to develop kind of a more integrated mixed income community?
Look, I do worry about speculation. Speculation driving up rents to levels that displace families. There are people who have been growing up in neighborhoods that can no longer afford to live in those neighborhoods. So that is cause for concern. But the best tool that we have for preventing speculation, for preventing gentrification, is rent regulation. Rent regulation preserves affordability in neighborhoods. And we have to ensure that Albany repeals vacancy decontrol. We're hemorrhaging and losing too many of our rent-regulated units. We've lost about 200,000 rent-regulated units since the 90s.
It's a fascinating answer because, many people would look at gentrification with new development. Your concern with gentrification is with older development and having people move out and other people displacing.
Well, even if gentrification could arise out of new development, when the quality of life in a neighborhood improves, one possible downside is an increase. As the quality of a neighborhood improves, so does the demand, and as demand rises, so does the price, so do the rents. But the best tool that we have for ensuring that neighborhoods remain affordable is rent regulation. It is by far the largest source of affordable housing, and we have to keep it intact. But we're losing hundreds of thousands of rent-regulated units.
The governor, I almost said Mario Cuomo, may he rest in peace, but of course Andrew Cuomo allocated $7.2 million for supportive housing, a new thing on Marion Avenue. This is done apparently without community input. The end of the article that announced it said that Community Board 7 is now deciding whether to approve the project. Whether or not you support this project, is there something wrong with this process? And I hear it, of course, on this show all the time that people are saying they're doing stuff and we don't have input, from our community on these things.
We should have input, of course. I mean, the community board should serve as a mechanism by which the community can weigh in on land use items. But I want to be clear, I'm a supporter of supportive housing. It is an attempt to house those who are at greatest risk of homelessness, those who are chronically homeless, and we do have a...
So should the governor then,
renew New York agreement which funds public housing? Yes, he should.
but also go to the community board and do other steps and simply cut a deal with a developer and announce it?
Look, we should have a more consultative process, but I think, I do worry that some of the opposition there are always apocalyptic fears about supportive housing,
Right.
that it's going to reduce the quality of life in a neighborhood, but none of those fears ever come true, right? You know, most of these supportive housing developments are architecturally attractive, and you know, we do have a serious crisis of homelessness. Supportive housing is much more cost effective than either street homelessness or shelter homelessness or emergency hospitalizations.
There are people in the Bronx that would disagree with you and say, well, you know what, we're inundated with these things in our community, and therefore, you know, the quality of life.
I'm not denying that but there's a demand for affordable housing, right? The numbers speak for themselves. I'm not plucking these numbers out of thin air. The facts speak for themselves.
Got it.
When you have 60,000 people in homeless
Last
shelters.
question, Councilman. Your first year is concluded. You're having a good time? You enjoy it? Is this what you expected? Any big surprises? Because we got to run.
I'm having a scandalously fun time.
Scandalously
I'm having so much fun that I feel like life is downhill from here. I've read enough Greek tragedies to know your fortunes can reverse easily. But thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, Councilman, this was your first visit, and we hope first of many more. Thank you very much for joining us. Folks, we have some viewer mail to review. This was we received a number of Facebook messages about our show on Hart Island. The first came from Ed C., and he wrote, "This was an excellent and informative show." We also got a note from Daniel C., and he said, "A public park is the stupidest idea ever, a complete waste of money and resources. Plant some trees and let it be home to birds and other animals. Humans will only destroy it." Sally D. wrote, "Whatever happens, there need to be accommodations to allow the families of the New Yorkers buried here to visit their graves." And finally, Terrence P. wrote on Facebook, "It is disgraceful that our society still strips humans of everything, even dignity." So we thank everybody for their comments. Of course, you're welcome to do that on our Facebook page, or you can send us an email at BronxTalk@bronxnet.org. Next week, it is the Women of Woodlawn. We thank our producer, Dahlia Gonzalez. Our director is Shirley Arietta. Once again, Happy New Year, and we'll see you next week.
I grew up in the housing projects of Cleveland. I didn't even know that life could be any better than it was. Education for me has been a way to get away from the agony of what was normal life. I want to be able to impact the community, not just look back on where I came from, but to reach back to where I came from and pull some people up with me. My name is David, and I am your dividend.